I'm Jonathan Zuckerman. This is Z Real Estate. So yesterday I was talking a little bit about short sale, about REO, how the two are connected and how they affect you. After the presentation I got a couple emails asking me to please explain a little bit better what I was referring to regarding the double up on the bad debt, the toxic asset, and exactly how it's related to short sale and how it affects you. So I'm going to try to explain it in a little bit different way, which I think will make a lot more sense and will be a lot clearer to everybody. So you have short sale and you have REO. REO stands for real estate owned, and that is basically another way of saying foreclosure. When a homeowner stops paying the bill, stops paying the mortgage, eventually the bank will take the house back. Begrudgingly. It's not exactly something the banks are elated about. They don't love foreclosing property. They're in the business of borrowing and lending, not in the real estate business. So when you pay the mortgage on your house, if you pay the mortgage as agreed, on time, and in the proper amount, your house is, in the eyes of the bank, called or considered or codified as a performing asset. Okay, so every performing asset that a bank has in their inventory increases their borrowing power. The more borrowing power they have, the more borrowing ability they have, which means the more ability they have to lend. The more money they can borrow, the more money they can lend. So the goal, at least as far as banks are considered, is to try to get as many performing assets as possible, which increases their borrowing ability. The very moment an asset is non-performing, that changes the whole dimension. It changes the whole game for the bank. So essentially, you're paying the bill on your house. The moment you stop paying, the bank forecloses. Once the property gets foreclosed upon, it is no longer called a performing asset. The codification changes internally to a non-performing asset. What does that mean for the bank? Well, once you have a non-performing asset, there are certain rules that have to be followed. The first one is the government says, okay, you have to double up on all bad debt. So let's say you have a $200,000 loan and that loan goes bad and the homeowner stops paying the bill. So the bank forecloses on that property. If the original loan was $200,000 and now that's a bad loan or a non-performing asset, the next thing that happens is the bank has to put another $200,000 aside. So now the bank has $400,000 in frozen funds, or funds that they cannot use, or more importantly, the way the bank looks at it, funds they cannot borrow against. So if the $400,000 was not non-performing, but rather performing, what would it mean for the bank? Well, as explained yesterday, it would mean that for every performing asset they have, they are allowed to borrow 3 to 5 times the amount of the performing asset. So in this scenario, we're talking about $400,000 in frozen funds. Now, if those same $400,000 were in a performing asset, within 1 month, they could borrow 3 to 5 times that amount, or $1.2 to $2 million. Within 6 months, that same amount is $10.8 to $50 million. In 12 months, we're looking at $32.4 million to $250 million off of $400,000. So, if $200,000 is the amount of a loan on a property, and that loan goes non-performing, and the bank forecloses, what does that mean? It means if it hadn't happened, the bank could have possibly borrowed against that property upwards of $32 million within 12 months. So this translates to what I like to call lost borrowing power. The banks are no longer allowed to borrow against that property. The more assets they have that fall into this classification, the more toxic the bank becomes. These are toxic assets. The more REOs a bank has, eventually the bank will no longer be able to become viable if they continue to have toxic assets, because as mentioned, they borrow against the performing assets. If their assets become non-performing, the only way to clear the situation is to convert the non-performing asset back into a performing asset via sale, via a new loan. So that's REO, and the way that it ties into short sale, and the reason why it's so important to understand, is because the banks are borrowing against the performing assets. So lots of times people say, John, I'm wondering, I know this guy, he hasn't paid a mortgage, he hasn't made a mortgage payment in 15 months, and he's still living in the property. How is that possible? What are the banks doing about it, and why does nobody care? Well, now you have a little bit of understanding about REO. So the banks, what they like to do is borrow against properties. The second they foreclose, they have to legally change the classification from a performing asset to a non-performing asset. So, as a result of this whole meltdown, this whole financial crisis, I'm sure you can imagine, there's been substantial governmental pressure on banks to do loan mods, workouts, HAFA, CHAFA, short sale, all types of different programs to help the homeowner. So what the banks have been doing as a result is accommodating, not specifically for the interest of complying, but also because, most importantly, it's in their self-interest. How? Well, let's say you have somebody who's not paying the bill on the mortgage. Let's say it's been 6 or 7 months now, and there's no mortgage payment. Regardless of whether the bank is getting paid for that property or not, as long as the classification internally for that asset remains performing, in other words, as long as the bank has not officially foreclosed, they are legally allowed to borrow against the property. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, last year, for example, notoriously, or when short sales started taking off, you had many situations where people were living in their house 16 months, 17 months, no mortgage payment, and nothing happening. Why? Well, the government would come by, and the government would audit the books and say, you know, we notice you're borrowing against these assets which are not collecting payments. Why are you doing this, and why have you not foreclosed? The bank's response is, well, we're working at a short sale. You know, we're trying to help the homeowner. Okay. So, basically, the reason why short sales are becoming more difficult now is because, well, the banks are no longer allowed to borrow against non-performing assets. Excuse me, when I say no longer allowed, they've never been allowed to. But at this point, the government is now putting a little bit more pressure. So when the government comes by and says, why are you borrowing against an asset that is not performing? Number one. And number two, why have you not classified this asset as non-performing? Why have you not foreclosed? When the bank then says, well, we're trying to work out a short sale, the current response is, that's fine, that's great, you can go ahead and do the short sale. However, you cannot delay foreclosure. There is a foreclosure timeline, and if you'd like to do a short sale, you can. But if that short sale cannot be completed by the time the REO timeline says you must foreclose, you must foreclose, period. So in 2009, 10, most notoriously 2011, short sales took forever. Sometimes a year, sometimes a year and a half. And the pressure to avoid foreclosure wasn't as strong as it is now, because it was exceptionally easy to delay a foreclosure. As long as there was something in the works regarding a short sale, foreclosure would be delayed and delayed and delayed. The problem is, if you think about what's happening behind the scenes, it truly is crippling our economy. The banks are borrowing against assets that they shouldn't be borrowing against. So, as a result, what's happening now is a lot of short sales, for better or for worse, are falling through at the last minute. They're falling through because the banks are not approving the short sales, because they're taking a little bit too long and they're approaching the REO timeline. If the short sale is coming close to culmination, but the REO deadline is also coming, many times the bank will do what they're legally required to do, which is foreclose. So, I apologize, and I hope that clears up some confusion. Again, my name is Jonathan Zuckerman. This is Z Real Estate. If you have any questions, you can always call me, 909-559-5275. You can find me at jonathanzuckerman.com, on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Yelp, Google+, or anything else I may not have thought of. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.